Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
I'm so gratified that many of us are okay saying that we're going to a therapist. If you went back like, I don't know, 20 years ago or before that, and you said the word therapist, people would look at you like, yeah, okay, great. And be thinking, oh, somebody has a problem. But no, it's
Right.
like a badge of honor. It's almost
Yeah.
like, hey, I'm going to talk to my friend, the therapist.
Yeah.
What he offers is very different. It's called IFS, and we're going to dig back into that and see how it can support people with many different challenges. Great to have him back here. Scott Moresi joins us on the program. Hey, Scott.
Hey, Steve. Great to be here.
Good to have you back and really expose, if you will, IFS. So let's go there. Let's kind of redefine what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I oftentimes think it's helpful to talk about what IFS is in contrast to what talk therapy is. When people come in for talk therapy, generally they're encouraged to get in touch with their thoughts, get in touch with their feelings, express those things, kind of get a kind of a pressure release, if you will, from getting it all out, and that can be helpful for sure. With IFS, the idea is, we don't so much engage the mental and emotional in the same way that we do in talk therapy. For instance, if someone comes in and, a moment ago we were talking about OCD. Let's say somebody has a tendency towards rumination. They have a tendency towards obsessive thought cycles and looping and things like that. And if they went to a talk therapist, they might be encouraged to talk about that, obviously, and to discuss the struggle that they have with the ways that their mind kind of gets stuck on loops, and the anxiety that comes with that. So in IFS we would say, okay, so you've got at least one part of you that tends to obsess, and there's probably other parts. By part we mean, in contrast to just saying I feel this or I think that, we take it a step further in that the idea is that, and it's a little bit of a switch in the mind. It really is, right? If you think I'm having this thought, then we identify with the thought. The thought is mine. As opposed to, and it's not just a language game, as opposed to a part of me is having this thought, it's also having this consequent feeling, maybe a body sensation, belief, or memory that goes with that thought looping. So then we work with the whole kind of what we call neural network, the whole piece of the brain that is engaged in this process. And we try to help the person develop what's called a relationship with that process, as opposed to just identifying with it as though it's them.
Now, identifying with it as though it's them, would that be traditional therapy? We see what you're
More or less.
dealing
More
with,
or less.
where it
Yeah.
came from.
Yeah. Yeah.
So interesting how IFS identifies the thought, the emotion, the side effect of the emotion. The best
The body
description I have.
sensation or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. It seems to me that why wouldn't therapy do that anyway? It's also important.
Well, that's a good question. And traditional talk therapies do some of that. For instance, they'll say, oh, okay, so like, for instance, a client might be talking about their obsessive part. Their obsessive part causes them to, let's say, get up in the morning and check that the oven's off. They have a hard time kind of believing that the oven's off. Some part of them is afraid of fires. And so from an IFS perspective, we would say, okay, well, it sounds like there's a part of you that's trying to protect you from danger. This might be the obsessional part. And then underneath that, there's parts of them most likely that feel very unsafe and under threat and under danger. And from an IFS perspective, that's probably being informed by earlier experiences of trauma, of not being able to get safe.
So with IFS, does that also take care of those things where it's believed that things from our childhood come back now and we have to deal with those?
Yeah. And in a lot of ways, like even as you and I are sitting here together right now, Steve, we could say that those parts of us, those childhood parts that in IFS we oftentimes call exiles, these young burdened parts that are beleaguered by memories and experiences of feeling shamed and not feeling good enough, or feeling rejected or abandoned or left out,
Sure.
and the consequent thoughts and feelings and beliefs that we take on as little kids. And as a result, those wounds tend to, strangely enough, from an IFS perspective, it seems that those wounds that happen kind of give birth to some extent to these protective parts that say, we're not going to let that happen again.
Interesting how you present
Yeah.
that, because I've never heard it said that way. And um, big believer, and even working, on my stuff from back in the day. And we all have it. We all, yeah, everybody's got stuff going on, especially from
Yeah.
childhood. But
Yeah.
how you say that those scenarios, and it could be anything. It could be, for me, I got bullied on the playground. That was one thing. So that,
Yeah.
that's one thing that the mind protects from. But
Right.
how you put it, as you just put it, what's birthed from those scenarios. I never heard it put that
Yeah.
way, but it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, exactly. There's a school of thought. There's a type of therapy called Hakomi that I trained in for a while before I got into internal family systems. And Hakomi was one of the schools that became IFS, and they talk about our original self, kind of like who we come into the world as, right? Before we experience any wounding, and then there's a wounding that happens eventually, right? Parents mess up in some way, or maybe something really bad happens, and that bursts what we call the wounded self, or the wounded parts of us. Those are the exiles. And then the wounded selves birth the strategic selves, or strategic parts, who say, we're not going to let this happen again, and we're not going to let that happen again. And that's where the systems idea comes in, that whenever we're dealing with, say, a sad part, for instance, a client comes into the office and feels sad, there's probably almost always other parts involved in that system, not just the sad part. There might be a scared part. There might be an angry part. There might be a worried part.
So safe to assume we got lots of parts to us.
That's for sure.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So let's look at OCD.
Yeah,
Somebody's dealing with that, and how IFS would help them overcome that or support that.
great. Yeah, okay. So IFS would, I work with a lot of clients with OCD. It's kind of a subspecialty of mine. And I've learned that one of the reasons I think IFS is so effective with OCD is a lot of the clients who come to me with OCD have been through the circuit. They've been through all the talk therapy, psychiatry, and meds, and they've struggled plenty. And some of the people have gotten some good help, and it's been really helpful for them. Other people, not so much. So they come in and they're tired and they're frustrated, and they're like, well, how are you going to help me? And I say, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to take this differently. So this ruminative, usually they're most aware, OCD folks are most aware of the parts that get them most activated, and that's those ruminative parts that just loop and loop and loop around stuff. Whether it's your boss, or whether it's a troubled relationship, or whatnot. Or you know oftentimes, how, like, someone with OCD may be having problems with their boss, let's say, but that problem with the boss is showing up as compulsive checking of light switches. And
Wow. Oh, interesting. So the issue with the boss manifests itself as compulsive something.
yeah,
Wow.
exactly. Checking light switches, checking door locks, checking ovens on or off. There's this sort of
Wow.
safety checking that happens.
Wow. I never realized that. So why is that being done with somebody who has OCD? Is it a way to refocus the attention away from the conflict with the boss?
I think that's part of it. Yeah, I think it's a great interpretation. And from a systems perspective, again with IFS, I think the idea is that, coming back to the idea of the original self, the wounded self, and the strategic self, or parts. With OCD, there's generally a deep underlying sense that I'm not safe, and there's like a exile. Maybe there's a cluster of exiles, young parts that are burdened, who believe we're not safe. And maybe they even feel like they don't have a right to be safe. And so given that's going on underneath the surface, or it can be, that tends to, in relationship to those burden parts, there's protectors that come online and say, okay, so what we got to do is get busy. We got to start checking things. We got to make sure everything's right. We got to clean. We got to vacuum. We got to scrub. That gives them, a sense of control of sorts, but they oftentimes feel really out of control while they're doing that.
Wow. I'm learning a lot here. These are things I wasn't aware of how that all works with somebody that is dealing with OCD. So would you identify with IFS where it began,
Where IFS began?
where somebody's OCD began?
Oh, with OCD, yes. Yeah, I think so to some extent. For instance, a lot of clients that I've worked with OCD, um, an early childhood divorce of their parents. That is a common one.
Sure.
Major upheaval, instability in the house, fighting between the parents, a general unsafe environment where the person was not able to establish safety on their own, or safety was not established for them by their caregivers. And so from that lack of safety, the underlying young burden part that says, I'm not safe, there's usually like a strategic part that says, we're going to keep you safe. And that part is hyper vigilant and always on.
Would you say that could happen with, let's say, somebody whose parents got divorced and they're a little bit older, let's say, 10, 12, somewhere around there?
Mhm. I think it's possible. Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely. Hmm.
Safety seems to be the bottom line here.
That's a lot of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I heard these three sentences and I love them and I've shared them with others. And it goes right back to what you're talking about, where let's say you're dealing with a situation and you just repeat to yourself, either verbally or just internally, I am not my thoughts. I am not my emotions. I am safe in this moment.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And
That's
people
that's a
have
great
told me
exercise.
it kind of brings them back. You got to say it a number of times, but when, things are going on, it kind of, but the reason I mention that is it seems to come back to safety. And
Yeah.
that's what your subconscious that's the ultimate goal. Make sure you're
Yeah.
safe.
I think that's right. I think in a lot of ways we're wired for safety. We're wired for connection and attachment, obviously, right? And
Sure,
when that
sure.
doesn't happen along important developmental milestones, then it tends to birth these wounds, and as a result, these strategic protectors.
Wow. So the OCD individual, traditional therapy, IFS, how are they different in treating OCD?
Well, in fairness to talk therapy, there are increasingly a number of talk therapy protocols that are more effective with OCD, and that's great. One of them is exposure response prevention. So that's a type of talk therapy that does show some promise with OCD and other types of exposure models. Um, Generalized talk therapy can be helpful with OCD in terms of helping people get more aware of their thoughts and their feelings and their body sensations, but it doesn't really directly engage them. And the problem is that too often, if someone has a tendency for OCD and they get into talking and talking and talking and talking, what that does is it kind of activates the system. It gets them kind of revved up, and
Mm.
those parts all start moving in their grooves within your brain, and they start taking on those roles. And oftentimes by the end of the session, the person may not feel better. And so or maybe in a way it feels better because it releases some of the pressure off the valve, but then they leave activated. So in IFS, we don't want people to leave activated. We want to engage them and their parts, their whole system, to what extent we can. Let's say someone comes into the office with OCD. Let's go back to the boss analogy. They have a mean boss that's running them down and making them feel bad.
Sure.
and they don't feel empowered in their life in a way to be able to stand up to their boss. Maybe circumstances don't allow them to stand up to their boss. And so there's this underlying sense of I'm not safe. I'm unsafe emotionally around my boss and coworkers. I'm unsafe in my job. I don't know how stable my job is now. So then that tends to activate parts of them that feel on edge, worried, unsafe, insecure, overwhelmed. And from there, all those young parts, those young burdened parts tend to communicate, if you will, through the nervous system, an experience of a lack of safety, which immediately fires on these protectors. And they say, we're going to take care of this. We're going to make sure that we're going to keep you occupied. We're going to make sure you don't think about your boss. We're going to have you so concerned about the light switches, the door locks, and the oven that you won't even notice your boss.
Wow. And it comes back to safety because you don't feel safe around your boss. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
What did it for you, Scott? When you discovered IFS, what was this is something good here.
Yeah, it's interesting, Steve. I honestly can say this is a weird thing to say and kind of acknowledge about myself, but I have been looking for IFS since I was in the 6th or 7th grade. I had no idea what it was called, but I knew what it was and I knew what I was looking for. I just didn't know what it was called. And I believed with almost a sense of undying faith that it existed. And I kept looking until I was, let's see, 6th grade, you're 12 or about. And I kept looking until about 7 years ago. So it was a long search through a lot of different models of therapy. And when I found it, it was a click. It was like, okay, now I kind of get this. I mean, I didn't get it all. There's a lot to it, of course, but it was kind of like this moment of fit or click, which said, okay, now I get when a client comes to me and they're anxious, it's not just the anxiety that they're dealing with. There's all these other parts in the mix.
Wow. Um, were you certified as a counselor or therapist before you found IFS, or that's where it began?
Yeah, I was licensed, originally I was licensed in 2011. I started grad school back in 2003 and trained up in the normal ranks like most of us do. And then, I found a model called TFCBT, Trauma Focused Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, back in 2008. I thought that was a great model, and I was fortunate to get some high level training in it, using it with some uh, challenging populations, and it was effective, but I wanted more. I wanted to be able to do more. And so I just kept looking and looking and looking. And finally, after going through years of training in EMDR and Hakomi and getting certified in EMDR, and, eventually I found IFS, and it was kind of like, it's really hard to, it was just what the best way I can put it, Steve. It was like a somatic sense of fit. Like it was no longer a square peg in a round hole. All of a sudden, that peg was round, and it just fit.
Yep. Wow. Um, CBT,
Yeah,
is that part of most talk therapy now?
yeah, to some extent. I mean, if people who are really like specialized in CBT, who certify in that, that's kind of usually their main vehicle of therapy. And so there is talk therapy involved, but they have all these different kinds of protocols that they adhere to as part of CBT. But it is a talk therapy generally, and it can be a very effective form of therapy for certain things. But it is like, given that it is a talk mode, I get a lot of calls from people who've been doing CBT and DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy.
I was just gonna mention that.
Yeah, I get a
Yeah.
lot of calls from people who've done that, and they usually say they get some help. They usually say that it does help with emotion regulation, it does help with fostering greater awareness, and that's all good stuff. And then eventually, oftentimes they feel like they hit a wall,
Mm,
and then they start reaching out and asking around, and somewhere along in their path they hear these three letters IFS, and
wow.
people come either kind of knowledgeable about what IFS is, or they have no idea. But their experience generally, in my experience, is that clients first experience with IFS, if they've never done it before, compared to something like talk therapy, CBT, is, it's oftentimes a practice of helping people get out of the identification with the mind, with the thoughts in the mind, because we so easily confuse the thoughts as, they are our thoughts. They are parts of our thoughts, which is a strange way of thinking about it, but they're not us. They're not actually us. And so if that's true, which it seems to be, well, if they're not us, then there's something that is, let's say, a part of us in some way. So then we can develop a relationship with that part that isn't just mental. We can, do you know what I mean?
Sure.
Because when we're up here, we're in this conceptual abstract framework. One thing I want to say, Steve, is that invariably, I think this is almost a generalized true statement, that trauma tends to take us out of our immediate experience of our bodies, right? We feel unsafe. There's like this flash of lack of safety or threat. And then there tends to be this consequent leaving the body in a way and sort of retreating up into a two-dimensional abstract conceptual framework of the mind, which has the effect of reducing us from the pain in our body. And then we try to make conceptual sense out of it. It's a great short-term strategy, not a very good long-term strategy.
I've heard people say before, who are going through triggers from traumas, that it almost feels like I'm in a movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that sounds like what you're talking about, where it's a disconnect from what's going on, where you're there, but you're not. And then back to, what we're talking about in terms of those traumas in our mind, it's really not us. And I guess it goes back to, I am not my thoughts. I am not my emotions, because you're really not. It's stuff that was put in there when you were a kid. Do you believe, final question here, I'm curious, because we started here a moment ago. Do you believe that we are all the same when born? Clean slate, assuming both two babies are healthy. It doesn't matter their culture, background, color, religion, none of that. It's a clean slate. They're both born. Right, here we go. Same time.
Yeah.
It's a clean slate. They haven't experienced anything. They don't even know a language, so they don't know that, their parents talk one language, the other talks. Would that be true to say that they're essentially two babies are born at the same time? They're basically the same.
I like the idea, and I think there is a lot of truth to it, right? But the only wrinkle I would add is that
genetics.
And this is IFS informed kind of thinking, is maybe they come into the world, let's say, free of personal burdens, to the extent there's no traumatic birth wound or something like that.
That's what I'm saying.
Right? They come into the world free of personal burdens. But again, from an IFS perspective, with regard to intergenerational trauma and legacy burdens,
yes,
they don't come into the world free of that.
I knew we were going to go there, and I got you. I got you on that. And, if we go deeper in some belief that there are generational traumas, even past lives, some may say that. There's all that. So I get what you're saying. So in terms of, I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah,
we're there.
I think so.
IFS, Scott, if somebody is hearing this, watching this, it's resonating. And again, we just focused on OCD today. It helps with many other challenges that somebody might be going through. How do they find you?
Yeah, they can find me at beyondwordspsychotherapy.com, or my number is 510-735-8868. Feel free to check in. Let me know if you're interested. If you like, schedule a free 30-minute consultation. Let's see if we're a good fit to work together.
Awesome. Thank you for breaking this all down today, and just another wonderful modality to help us. Somebody has been down the road of therapy, and like you said, they're at a wall, they're stuck. There's more out there, and there's great people like you, Scott, to help. Thank you so much.
Sure thing. Thank you, Steve.
We'll be right back.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.